The best documentation of natural selection has to do with an abnormal form of hemoglobin caused by a point mutation. You recall that how information is communicated by DNA is by the order in which the bases appear. Could one base difference make a difference in a person or something else? And so this is an example of a mutation in hemoglobin, which carries oxygen to the cells in the body. Most people have normal hemoglobin, and that's referred to as hemoglobin A, but there is an alternate abnormal form referred to as hemoglobin S. The S is for sickle cell. What the difference is between normal hemoglobin and a sickle cell is that a normal hemoglobin is round. Think of sort of a donut shape without the hole in the center. It's flexible enough to get through little narrow capillaries so that all the organs in the body get the oxygen that they must have. The sickling hemoglobin, and I always think of photos where they show, well, they weren't photos, drawings of the scythe of people long ago where it was crescent shape, or sometimes you see a crescent shape on flags, but where they were cutting grain. So it's curved and it's narrow and it's rigid. It's smaller than the round, flexible one. So there is an abnormal hemoglobin gene that is this shape, gives to this shape. Most people in the world are homozygous normal for the flexible one. Homozygous meaning that they have the same, homo referring to the same, that they have the same gene from both parents. So they both have the normal. In some cases, they have what's referred to as a sickle trait. And that means that one parent had the normal and the other parent has a gene for the sickle shape. And it is referred to as being heterozygous, meaning it's a different. The hetero meaning different. So one parent's contribution to this is normal and the other is the crescent. And then for those who happen to get that sickle shape from both parents, and so they're said to be homozygous, some people before the term of homozygous would say pure sickle cell. They have sickle cell anemia. And what a difference it makes in their life. They will have, it expresses itself as they will have a blockage of these cells, which are referred to as a crisis, and they will bunch up in normal little places without any warning, and those who have this report it as being extremely painful. One patient that was videoed by Channel 2 and shown on their 60 Minutes said that she was just writhing in pain in emergency. And that's before people unfamiliar with this, the doctor thought maybe she was pretending. No, she was in extreme pain. And it can do tremendous damage. You know, imagine not getting the oxygen to the brain or any part of the body. It can be, you can have damage to those cells. It's life-shortening, and though something is being developed now by scientists where they've actually been able to cure it. If you can imagine, because this is every cell in the body, how could they change every cell in the body from its sickle shape? Well, that's what their program on 60 Minutes was going to show. So, if a person has that, then it is life-shortening, and you think, well, if it's that disastrous, and why doesn't this harmful gene just work its way out of the population? They die, they can't pass that on to the next generation, but there is something in the natural environment that is sort of a driver that keeps this gene very successful. Natural selection, what is in the environment, can change from one situation to the next. And what makes the difference is that while that individual who has that gene from both parents, the sickle cell anemia, the individual who has it one from each parent, normal from one, the sickling from the other, has a high resistance to malaria. They are even healthier than someone who is homozygous normal. And so they're feeling good while the normal person, they in their malaria, having chills and fever and all the things that malaria can deliver to you. So this is one of the best documented for humans of natural selection being a driver of a mutation. Now suppose both members of a couple are heterozygous for this trait. So they both, male and female, have one normal hemoglobin gene and one sickling gene. If they have children, what is the chance of them having a child with a sickle cell anemia? Normal hemoglobin is dominant to the sickling hemoglobin. And what that means, when you have those two genes together, we say the genotype, and genotype means the actual genetic makeup, is 50% normal, 50% for sickling, but the phenotype means what you observe, what actually happens. And the phenotype is that this heterozygous person doesn't get it. And so when a child, if they receive one of each type of hemoglobin, they're going to be healthy. And if you had a Punnett square, which shows what the outcome would be as far as 4 possible outcomes, 1/4 would be 100% normal hemoglobin. 50%, or 2 possibilities, would be just like the parents. So 50% of a 4 possible outcome, you can see why this just keeps continuing on. And then the last, where the child gets the recessive from both parents, that child has it. So there's one chance in 4 with each conception that a child of 2 heterozygous parents for this trait would have sickle cell anemia. And to clear up any confusion, some might think, well, if that first child has the sickle cell anemia, well then the other three are going to be, next three children to be okay. They've already had the one. Well, that's, they need to understand that this is the conception ratio for each pregnancy. Carrying one gene for the sickling trait, as it's called, isn't beneficial in Los Angeles because we don't have malaria. But if you lived in an area that does, such as Africa and other places, where millions die every year from the sickling, well then it certainly is a factor. Recall that evolution is and what is considered success, it's reproductive success. Well, Los Angeles does not have malaria, and so being heterozygous is not a benefit. The Los Angeles Times reported a number of years ago that in South Los Angeles there were more than 5,000 people there who have sickle cell anemia. The hospital in that area has a new sickle cell building, and so it's not just something far away from our environment where people are suffering from this, but it's good to be aware of our own community and to think all of this is just from one base. Now you know an amino acid has 3 bases, and this particular DNA had about 146 amino acids for the hemoglobin, and 1 base of all of that. So once again, what you would draw from that is that it's the sequence of the bases that spells out instructions to the cell, and this sequence was disturbed. And it's called a point mutation because it's just one base out of an amino acid of all these bases that make up hemoglobin. Another example of natural selection and how it changes because the environment has changed is one that I never imagined would be in the Los Angeles Times. It is in a 2nd chapter of the textbook, and it describes a moth. And in the photo, there's a white moth, there's a black moth, and if you were to take that page and hold it up to someone across the room, what they could see from a distance would be the white one. And the story behind this is that one time in England there were roughly equal numbers of black and dark moths. And then with the industrialization, and no one was concerned about pollution control or the darkening of the buildings, the bark of trees became dark, the blackened buildings, and they noted that in that time the percent of white moths became very low, and the dark ones blended right into the background. So it was an example of how that environment had changed. Later on, when they had some control over all the soot and smoke that was adhering to every surface, the balance of the white and the dark began to be more varied. Not quite equal, but there were white ones then. But you can see if a bird was flying by and all I could see was the white ones, well then that's why they were disappearing. So the next generation is a result of where there's been reproductive success. You hear statements like fitness of the strongest, or as if it was something physical. It has to do whether or not that particular type of life lives to maturity and reproduces. And if those young in turn live to maturity and reproduce. So that is what is considered success. Variation in life makes possible for natural selection. If everything was the same, there wouldn't be any change as a result of natural selection. A person named Lamarck thought that change took place through the generations by giraffes stretching their necks. It sounds a little bit like a child's bedtime story. They keep stretching their neck and stretching the neck, and finally their necks are longer. Darwin recognized that there were variety among giraffes in neck length, just like there's variety in many kinds of life. And so when there was a shortage of food, those that might make it through that dry time would be those with a longer neck, because they could not only lean over and get the food available to the shorter necked ones, but they could reach higher in the trees and that would get food, and that might be just the difference to make that through that harsh season of limited food. And so then suppose years pass and there's plenty of food and you still have variation in the neck length, but they're a bit longer in their variety. Well, if that happens again, then once more those of these longer necked ones, those that have a bit longer than the others, they have access to food. And so with time, that's how change occurred. The reason why malaria had developed so, there hadn't always been malaria in Africa. It had to do with farming practices. The area in Africa, much of it had just been thick forests. And then the people had a material that was hard enough that they could chop down trees. And so they began to move into these forests, cut down trees, plant yams or cassava, and tropical areas, forested areas, have very shallow soil. You'd think with all these trees growing and all this greenery, they must have wonderful soil, but typically they do not. And so with the trees missing, the soil then becomes thinner and it has not absorbed that water. When the trees were there, the ground would absorb the rainfall. But now the ponds or pools of water would collect, and that's a site for mosquitoes to come. And so this is an example what they would call biocultural, meaning there's biology and the cultural, the inner working to cause this change. The cultural part being the farming practices that set up an environment for mosquitoes and therefore malaria. So biocultural, and you can tell from the term it has to do with the biology but also the cultural, the farming. And there is another example as well. And that example has to do with the ability to drink milk. Do you know that in milk there is sugar? Many people stand in line at the grocery store and they'll pick up a candy bar, turn it over, check the sugar content, and buy it anyway, or they might put it back. But milk has sugar of 12 grams or 14 grams. And many people cannot handle that sugar. And the reason why, most babies when they're born, they have an enzyme called lactase that helps digest the sugar. The sugar in the milk is called lactose. And you might be one of these where milk is, or ice cream is not a pleasure. Now, one person was quoted as saying, well, they didn't like to go to birthday parties so they couldn't eat the ice cream like everyone else could, and because it gives you stomach cramps. Well, most people have that lactase until a certain age, and then it just turns off as if you were to go over and turn off a light switch. And from then on, they avoid it. Now, where the cultural part comes in, those who take care of herd, they're called pastoralists if they have cows or goats that produce milk. They have had a mutation where they can handle the milk with passage of time. And so in Africa, there are some pastoralists, they're almost like islands of milk drinkers compared to the surrounding people around them who could not drink, because those people don't take care of animals, they were out hunting them for food. But here the pastoralists are taking care of the cows and the goats. And so if you have this kind of mutation, and it fosters others having it, and so that's an example of biocultural and natural selection. The cultural being that. And that happens in many of the areas of the world where they handle milk-producing animals, thinking of some of the places in Northern Europe.